I'm so glad you're here tonight. Let's get started. The snow began at noon and did not stop for 3 days. Above the village of Montaillou, in the high valleys of the county of Foix, a shepherd named Pierre Maury sat inside a low stone hut with his knees drawn up to his chest, listening to the wind test the roof beam by beam. He had banked the fire as low as it would go without dying, because wood up here was carried on a man's back for an hour before it ever reached the hearth, and a man learned early not to waste what he could not easily replace. Outside, 300 sheep pressed themselves into a fold built into the lee of a rock face, their combined breath rising into the dark like something alive. Pierre Maury did not sleep much that night. He got up twice to check the fold, because a shepherd who slept through a storm might wake to find that half his flock had suffocated under drift, or that a hungry wolf had used the snow to muffle its approach. This was not paranoia. It was arithmetic. A man's entire livelihood, his family's food for the year, the wool that would become the coin that would become the roof over his own head, stood outside in the dark, and it could not save itself. This is not a scene invented for effect. We know Pierre Maury existed. We know roughly what his winters looked like, and we know it because of an extraordinary accident of history. A French bishop named Jacques Fournier, hunting heretics in the early 14th century, sat men and women like Pierre Maury down in front of a scribe and made them describe their lives in detail, under oath, for the official record. He was not trying to write social history. He was trying to convict Cathars, but in doing so he preserved, almost by mistake, one of the most detailed pictures we have of what it actually felt like to be a shepherd in the medieval mountains, in his own words, filtered through a notary's Latin. Historians would later mine that register for a book called Montaillou, and it remains one of the few places where a medieval shepherd gets to speak instead of simply being spoken about. So this is a story about people like Pierre Maury. But before we go further, there is something worth being honest about, because the honest version is more interesting than the tidy one. Most shepherds in medieval Europe did not, in fact, try to survive the winter at altitude. They ran from it. The entire logic of pastoral life in mountain regions, from the Pyrenees to the Alps to the Apennines, was built around one central strategy: move the flock down before the snow arrives, and back up once it melts. This seasonal movement had a name, transhumance, and it was not a survival technique for winter in the mountains, so much as an elaborate, centuries-old system for avoiding it. The shepherds who wintered in the high country were not the norm. They were the exception, the ones who had no lowland pasture to walk to, or no money to rent it, or a flock too small to be worth the journey, or a particular kind of stubbornness that kept them in a valley their family had occupied for generations. Both stories matter, and neither one is more true than the other. There were shepherds who beat the winter by leaving, and shepherds who beat it by staying and enduring it. What we are going to do tonight is follow both roads, because together they tell you something almost no single account can. How a civilization without central heating, without waterproof fabric, without antibiotics, without so much as a reliable clock, built an entire economy on the coldest, least forgiving terrain in Europe, and made it work well enough that it lasted, essentially unchanged in its bones, for the better part of 1,000 years. Before any of that, though, a small note. If you're the kind of person who finds comfort in slow, carefully told history, in the kind of detail that makes the past feel less like a museum exhibit and more like a place you could have lived, you're in the right spot. There's no rush here tonight. Settle in. The grass that moves to understand why a shepherd in 1300 might spend his life walking, rather than simply staying put with his sheep in one field. You first have to understand something about the mountains themselves, something that has nothing to do with medieval technology, and everything to do with basic ecology. A mountain does not produce the same amount of grass all year. In the high pastures, above 2,000 meters, in places like the Pyrenean cirques or the Alpine Alps, the word Alp originally just meant a high summer pasture, long before it meant the mountain range itself. The growing season might last 4 months, sometimes less. Snow can linger into June at those elevations and return by October. For those 4 fertile months, though, the grass that grows there is extraordinary. Dense, mineral-rich, watered by melting snow, untouched by insects that cannot survive the cold, and free of the parasites that plague lowland pasture in the wet heat of a Mediterranean summer. Flock grazing high alpine meadow in July puts on weight and produces milk in a way that the same flock never could on a lowland field in the same month, because the lowland field is baked dry and brown by then, and the high pasture is at its peak precisely when the valley floor has nothing left to offer. So the mountains were never useless in summer. They were, if anything, the best grazing available anywhere in the region, for exactly the season when the lowlands were failing. The problem was the other 8 months. Winter reversed everything. The high pasture vanished under snow that might sit 2 or 3 meters deep in a hard year, and even where wind kept some slopes bare, the cold itself stopped grass from growing at all. A flock left at altitude through winter would starve long before it froze, because there would simply be nothing left to eat, and no way to move enough hay up a mountain trail to feed several hundred animals for 4 or 5 months. Hay is heavy. A sheep eats roughly 2 to 3 kilograms of dry forage a day just to maintain its body weight through a cold winter, more if it is pregnant or nursing, and multiplying that by a flock of 300 or 400 animals across 150 days of winter produces a number of tons that no medieval pack animal, and certainly no human back, could realistically haul up a mountain track before the passes closed. The lowlands, meanwhile, worked in the opposite rhythm. The Mediterranean plains of Roussillon, Catalonia, Provence, and the Po Valley baked and dried through summer, offering poor grazing exactly when the mountains were at their richest, but came alive again with the autumn rains, producing a second flush of green pasture through the mild coastal winter that never saw the kind of snow the mountains did. A flock could graze those lowland plains from November through April in reasonable comfort, while the high pastures they had just left sat buried and silent. This is the entire logic of transhumance in a single sentence. Two landscapes, each useless when the other is thriving, connected by a walk. And the walk itself, which we will come to shortly, was neither short nor simple. Some flocks in Spain traveled routes exceeding 700 kilometers between summer and winter pasture. A migration on the scale of the animal world's great seasonal movements, except conducted on foot by men with sheep, along the same paths their fathers and grandfathers had used, often for centuries before any king or church ever wrote the arrangement down. It's worth pausing here to say something about why this mattered beyond the shepherd's own comfort. Wool was, for much of the medieval period, one of the most valuable commodities a landlocked region could produce. It didn't spoil the way grain could. It could be carried long distances without much loss of value, unlike milk or fresh meat. It fed an enormous continental textile industry, from the workshops of Flanders to the looms of Florence, and the price a flock of well-fed sheep could fetch, in wool, in milk turned to cheese, in lambs sold at market, was often the single largest source of cash income available to a mountain community that otherwise lived close to subsistence. A shepherd walking his flock 400 kilometers to winter pasture was not simply keeping his animals alive. He was protecting, quite literally, his village's access to the medieval cash economy. Grain you could eat, wool you could sell, and sold wool bought the salt, the iron tools, the occasional luxury that no mountain valley produced on its own. None of this was written in a book that a shepherd consulted. It was carried, generation to generation, in the same way a language is carried, through practice, through correction, through a father walking a route with his son, until the son's feet knew it without thinking. And it is that knowledge, patient and largely undocumented, that we are going to spend the rest of this evening trying to recover. The roads before roads long before there were roads in the sense we would recognize, paved and mapped and named. There were droveways, the ancient tracks along which livestock had moved between summer and winter pasture for so long that nobody could say when the practice began. In Spain, this network came to be called the Cañadas reels, the royal drove roads, and by the late medieval period, they formed a system stretching across the entire Iberian Peninsula, some of them 90 meters wide by law, wide enough for a flock of several thousand sheep to pass without trampling a farmer's neighboring field into ruin. The width mattered because a moving flock is not a tidy column. Sheep spread when they walk, especially merino sheep, the breed that came to dominate Spanish transhumance, and whose fine wool would eventually make Spain one of the wealthiest wool-producing regions in Europe. A drove road narrow enough to force the flock into single file would slow the migration to a crawl and expose the animals to exhaustion. So the Cañadas were kept broad, and their boundaries were, in theory, protected by royal decree from encroachment by farmers eager to plow up free grazing land for their own crops. In practice, the boundaries were disputed constantly, in village after village, for centuries, because a farmer looking at 90 meters of unplanted land, running past his field, saw an obvious temptation, and a shepherd looking at that same strip saw the only guarantee that his flock would reach winter pasture at all. The organization behind the Spanish droveways eventually acquired a name and an institutional structure. The Mesta, a guild of sheep owners formally recognized by the Crown of Castile in 1273, though the practices it regulated were considerably older than the institution itself. The Mesta did not own the sheep. Its members did, ranging from small farmers with a few dozen animals to monasteries and noble families who might own flocks numbering in the tens of thousands. What the Mesta provided was legal protection for the migration itself, fixed routes, fixed rules about grazing rights along the way, a system of courts to settle disputes between shepherds and the villages whose land the flocks crossed, and eventually a significant tax revenue for the crown, which had every incentive to keep the wool trade flowing, since it was one of Castile's most reliable sources of income. For the ordinary shepherd, none of this institutional machinery meant an easy walk. Consider what the migration actually required. A flock might begin its journey from the high pastures of the Cantabrian Mountains or the Sierra de Gredos in September, as the first frosts touched the peaks, and walk south for 6 weeks or more, covering perhaps 20 to 25 kilometers on a good day, less through difficult terrain or bad weather, until it reached winter pasture in Extremadura or Andalusia, sometimes as far as 700 kilometers from where it started. The shepherds walked the entire distance on foot, alongside the flock, sleeping wherever the day's march ended, eating whatever they had carried or could obtain along the route, exposed to the same rain and cold as the animals they tended, with only a cloak, a staff, and the company of dogs and fellow shepherds for comfort. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what this life did to a man's body, because the sources, sparse as they are, do give us glimpses. Shepherds who spent decades on the drove roads are described in surviving records as bent, weathered, often lame in one leg, or another from old injuries that had never properly healed. Since there was rarely a physician within reach when a shepherd's ankle turned on a loose stone somewhere in the Sierra de Guadarrama, a twisted ankle that might mean a week off work for a modern person meant, for a medieval shepherd on the move, either walking through the pain or falling behind the flock. And falling behind the flock was rarely a survivable option for very long, not for the shepherd's livelihood, and sometimes not for the shepherd himself. The dogs deserve mention here too, because no shepherd made this journey alone in any meaningful sense. The great Spanish mastiffs, the Mastin Espagnol, bred specifically for the drove roads, were not herding dogs in the way we might picture a modern sheepdog nipping at heels to direct a flock. They were guardians, bred large and fierce enough to fight wolves, fitted with spiked iron collars called carlancas that protected their throats from a wolf's bite during exactly the kind of nighttime attack that Pierre Maury, 400 kilometers away in the Pyrenees, also feared. A single mastiff could weigh over 50 kilograms, and a shepherd traveling with 2 or 3 such dogs was, in effect, traveling with an armed escort, because a wolf pack that might otherwise test a flock guarded only by men would think twice about a line of dogs bred and trained for exactly that confrontation. And yet, even with dogs, even with law on his side, even with an institution as powerful as the Mesta backing his right to pass, a shepherd on the Cañadas reel faced a kind of loneliness that is hard to fully recover from the records. He might go weeks without sleeping under a roof. He might cross entire regions where he spoke a different dialect than the local farmers. Since medieval Spain, like most of medieval Europe, was a patchwork of dialects and even languages that shifted every few dozen kilometers. He carried with him everything he needed because there was no guarantee anyone along the route would sell him what he lacked. And he did all of this twice a year, every year, for as long as his body held out, because the alternative, wintering the flock in the mountains where the migration began, meant near certain starvation for the animals and probable ruin for the family who depended on them. We should say plainly here that this system, however impressive in its organization, was never gentle to the men who operated it. The Mesta protected wool. It protected the crown's tax revenue. It protected, in a real if indirect sense, the broader economy of Castile. It did comparatively little to protect the individual shepherd, who remained, throughout the medieval period and well beyond it, among the poorest and least powerful figures in an economic chain that made a great many other people wealthy. Those who stayed, not every mountain shepherd had a cañada to walk, and not every flock could afford the journey, even where the roads existed. This is where our story turns toward the shepherds who genuinely did winter in the high country, because their experience, though less common than transhumance, is in many ways the more remarkable one, and it is these communities that best answer the question in our title. In the Alps, unlike in Spain, the geography did not always offer a convenient lowland within easy walking distance. Alpine valleys are steep-sided and narrow, and while some alpine flocks did practice a version of transhumance, moving down to valley floor villages for winter, rather than remaining at the high summer pastures, the distance involved was often a matter of a few hundred meters of elevation change rather than hundreds of kilometers. The flock came down from the Alp, in the specific sense of the high summer meadow, to the village itself, where it wintered in stone byres attached to or beneath the family home, eating hay that had been cut and stored through the very same summer the flock had spent at altitude. This detail matters enormously, because it means the entire alpine system, unlike the great Iberian migrations, depended on a single, unforgiving arithmetic problem that every household had to solve anew each year. How much hay can this family cut, dry, and store before the first snow? And does that amount equal or exceed what the flock will need to survive until the grass returns in spring? Yet the sum wrong. Cut too little hay through a summer lost to bad weather or short-handed labor. And there was no institution like the Mesta to fall back on. No drove road leading to a rescue in the south. There was only a choice between slaughtering animals early to reduce the number of mouths needing feed, or watching the flock, and with it, much of the family's wealth, starve slowly over the final weeks of a long winter. The hay itself tells us something about how seriously mountain communities took this problem. Alpine farmers cut grass from every scrap of usable slope, including terrain so steep that cutting it required a man to work with one hand gripping a rope, or a fixed stake driven into the hillside while the other hand swung the scythe. A practice that persisted in some alpine regions well into the modern era, precisely because the underlying problem, not enough flat land to grow winter feed, never really went away. Hay was dried on wooden racks, stored in barns built specifically to keep it from rotting in the damp mountain air, and rationed through the winter with a precision that speaks to how little margin these households had. A bad hay year in the Alps was not an inconvenience. It was often the difference between a flock that survived to see spring pasture again and one that did not. The Scottish Highlands offer a different version of the same underlying problem. And here the surviving evidence, though still frustratingly thin for the medieval period specifically, describes a system called shieling, in which a portion of the community, often women, children, and the elderly, moved with the cattle and sheep to summer grazing in the high glens, while the rest of the settlement remained at the lower, permanent township. Come autumn, the shieling folk and their animals returned to the township, where the flocks wintered close to the main settlement, sheltered where possible in the lee of stone walls, in rough shielings converted for the purpose, or simply left to forage what they could on ground the household had reserved through the summer, specifically because it would still offer some grazing after the first frosts. Highland winters, unlike alpine ones, are not typically defined by the same depth of snow you find at comparable altitudes in the Alps or Pyrenees. Since the maritime climate of northern Scotland tends to produce cold, wet, and windy conditions, rather than the deep, dry cold and heavy snowpack of a continental mountain range. This sounds, on the surface, like it should have made things easier. In practice, many shepherds and historians who have studied Highland agriculture argue the opposite. A Highland winter's relentless wet cold, without the insulating benefit of a stable snowpack, could be harder on livestock than a colder but drier winter elsewhere, because wet cold penetrates wool and chills an animal's skin in a way that dry cold, paradoxically, often does not. A sheep can survive remarkably low temperatures if it stays dry. A sheep soaked through by weeks of freezing rain with no let up and no sun to dry its fleece, can die of exposure at temperatures that would seem mild on a thermometer. This single fact, more than almost any other, explains why Highland shepherds built their winter strategy less around finding warmth and more around finding shelter from wind and rain. Specifically, stone folds, built low and thick-walled, oriented so their open side faced away from the prevailing weather, did less to keep animals warm in any direct sense than to keep them dry and out of the wind, which turned out to matter more. We will look closely at these structures and their equivalents across other mountain regions in the chapter that follows, because the architecture of medieval shelter tells you almost as much about medieval understanding of cold as any written record could. For now, though, the point worth sitting with is this: the shepherds who wintered in the mountains, whether in the Alps, the Highlands, or the smaller valleys of the Pyrenees that lacked easy access to a drove road, were not simply the transhumant shepherds minus a journey. They faced a genuinely different set of problems that had no institutional solution like the Mesta, no legal protection for a rite of passage, no 90-meter wide road guaranteeing access to somewhere warmer. Their survival depended almost entirely on decisions made locally, household by household, valley by valley, refined over generations by nothing more systematic than which families managed to keep their flocks alive through the worst winters, and which did not. Stone, turf, and smoke, if you walk the high pastures of Provence today, in the region once known as the Garrigue and the plateaus above it, you will still find, scattered across the hillsides, small round or oval stone huts with corbelled roofs, built entirely without mortar, each stone laid so that it leaned slightly inward toward the ones above it, until the whole structure closed itself over like a beehive. These are the bories, sometimes called cabinons, and while many that survive today date from later centuries, the building technique itself is ancient, likely stretching back well before the medieval period, and was in continuous use by shepherds and farmers through the Middle Ages and beyond. The genius of the corbelled dry stone hut lies in what it does not require. It needs no timber roof beam, which mattered enormously in regions where trees were scarce at higher elevations, or where wood was too valuable as fuel and building material both to spend on a shepherd's temporary shelter. It needs no mortar, which meant it could be built and repaired by the shepherd himself, using stones cleared from the very field he was trying to make usable for grazing, so that clearing the land and building the shelter were, in a real sense, the same task performed with the same materials. And because the stones were laid dry, without any binding material to trap moisture, the structure breathed in a way that kept the interior surprisingly dry even through weeks of rain, something a mud or turf structure often struggled to manage. What a bory could not do was hold heat particularly well, at least not in the way a modern insulated building would. Stone is a poor insulator on its own, It conducts cold as readily as it conducts warmth, which is why anyone who has stood inside an old stone church in winter knows the particular bone-deep chill of a space built entirely from rock. What the Bori offered instead was shelter from wind and precipitation, which, as we noted in the previous chapter regarding Highland sheep, mattered more for survival than warmth in any absolute sense. A shepherd inside a Bori, huddled near a small fire, whose smoke found its way out through gaps in the stonework rather than a proper chimney, was not warm by any modern standard. He was, however, dry, out of the wind, and shielded from the direct radiative loss of heat to a clear night sky that made unsheltered ground so much colder than sheltered ground, even at the same air temperature. Further north and higher into the Alps proper, the architecture shifts toward the mazot, and the chalet, wooden structures built from massive timber logs, their walls thick enough to provide genuine insulation in a way dry stone rarely achieved, roofed with heavy stone slabs called lauses that could withstand the weight of accumulated snow without collapsing. A real risk with lighter roofing materials in regions where snow load could exceed several hundred kilograms per square meter after a heavy winter. The Alpine chalet as a building type, though it would not take on its now familiar tourist brochure appearance until centuries later, already had its essential logic in place by the high medieval period. A stone or partially stone ground floor housing the animals, whose body heat rose and warmed the living quarters above through the floorboards. A practice so widespread across the Alps that it amounted to a form of passive heating built directly into the architecture of the house itself. This detail, animals housed beneath or alongside the family's living space, specifically, so their body heat could warm the humans above, appears again and again across medieval mountain Europe, from the Alps to the Pyrenees to parts of the Carpathians, and it tells you something important about medieval priorities that might not be obvious at first. We tend to think of livestock and human living space as naturally separate, something a modern sense of hygiene assumes without examining. A medieval mountain household had no such luxury of separation, because a cow or a flock of sheep housed in a barn some distance from the house represented heat wasted, heat that could otherwise be warming the family through the floor or the shared wall, at a time when firewood itself was neither unlimited nor free of labor to gather and haul. In the Scottish Highlands, the equivalent structure was often simpler and more temporary. Turf-built shielings for summer use in the high glens, and stone-walled folds, sometimes roofed and sometimes left open to the sky, but oriented against the prevailing wind, for the animals wintering closer to the township. Turf, as a building material, offered decent insulation, since the trapped air within cut turf performs a genuine thermal function, but it demanded near constant maintenance against the near constant rain, and a turf roof that failed during a winter storm could mean sudden and complete exposure for whatever sheltered beneath it. Highland shepherds understood this trade-off well enough that many winter folds for sheep, specifically, forwent a roof altogether, accepting that shelter from wind and a dry standing surface mattered more than a roof likely to fail at the worst possible moment, and settling instead for thick walls, well-drained ground, and a careful choice of site tucked against a natural rock face or hillside that did much of the wind-blocking work the walls alone could not. It is worth pausing on that last point, the choice of site, because it represents a kind of knowledge that no written source records in any systematic way, and yet clearly existed and was passed down with real precision. A shepherd choosing where to build a winter fold was not guessing. He was reading the land, which slope caught the worst of the prevailing wind, and which slope was sheltered by a ridge above it, which hollow collected cold air on a still night in a way that made it colder than more exposed ground nearby. A real phenomenon called cold air drainage that shepherds clearly understood empirically long before anyone gave it a name in a textbook, and which slopes drained well enough that a fold built there would not become a frozen mudpit by midwinter. None of this knowledge survives in a single medieval manuscript describing exactly how to site a sheepfold. It survives instead in the folds themselves, thousands of them, still standing in more or less the same spots their builders chose, because the builders got the choice right often enough that later generations saw no reason to move them. The weight of wool, a modern person picturing medieval winter clothing tends to imagine something crude, and in many respects, that imagination is correct. But the shepherd's own clothing deserves closer attention than the stereotype allows, because it represents one of the few pieces of medieval technology that the shepherd himself often made, using the very product his flock produced. And it reveals a surprising amount of applied understanding about how to survive extreme cold with almost nothing beyond raw wool, a needle, and time. The basic garment of the mountain shepherd across most of medieval Europe was some version of a heavy wool cloak, often unfinished or only loosely felted, worn over a woolen tunic, and where the shepherd could manage it, additional layers beneath. The specific advantage of wool in this context is worth explaining plainly, because it is not simply that wool is warm in the way we might casually assume. Wool fiber has a structure that traps air within its natural crimp, and unlike cotton or linen, it retains a meaningful portion of its insulating capacity even when wet, because the fiber itself absorbs moisture into its core rather than allowing water to sit on the surface and conduct heat away from the body as efficiently as it would with other natural fibers. A wool cloak soaked through by a mountain storm was heavier and less comfortable than a dry one, certainly, but it did not fail catastrophically as an insulator the way a linen garment would have. This was not something a medieval shepherd understood in terms of fiber chemistry. It was something he understood because he had worn wet wool through 100 storms and lived, and had likely watched, at some point, what happened to a companion who tried linen instead. Beneath the cloak, many shepherds wore a version of felted wool boot or wrapping, sometimes stuffed with dried grass or moss for additional insulation, a practice recorded in various forms from the Alps to Scandinavia, and likely far more widespread than the surviving evidence directly confirms, since foot care in extreme cold represented one of the most immediate and dangerous problems a shepherd faced. Frostbite of the extremities, and specifically of the feet, was a documented and feared hazard, not merely an inconvenience, because a shepherd whose feet failed him through frostbite severe enough to threaten gangrene faced consequences that a medieval mountain community had almost no means of treating. There was no reliable amputation surgery available in most of these remote valleys, certainly nothing resembling anesthesia, and a severe infection following frostbite could and did kill. Layering itself, the basic principle of trapping insulating air between several thinner garments rather than relying on one thick one, appears to have been well understood in practice, even if no medieval shepherd would have described it in those terms. Multiple thinner wool layers, worn one over another, trap more warm air near the body than a single garment of equivalent total thickness, because each layer boundary creates its own pocket of still air, and still air is a far better insulator than moving air or than the wool fiber itself. A shepherd who owned several worn, thin woolen garments and layered them together was, without any formal knowledge of thermodynamics, applying a principle that modern outdoor clothing design still relies on. Gloves, where they existed at all for shepherds working with their hands through much of the day, tended to be simple and often abandoned in favor of bare hands for tasks requiring fine motor control. Since a lambing ewe in difficulty, a task we will return to shortly, required a shepherd's bare fingers to assist, gloves or no gloves, cold or no cold. This trade-off, dexterity against warmth, appears repeatedly in accounts of mountain shepherding, and it represents one of the genuinely brutal aspects of the work that no amount of clever wool technology could fully solve. There were tasks that simply required exposing bare skin to conditions that would otherwise call for every possible layer of protection, and the shepherd performed them anyway because the alternative, a dead ewe or a dead lamb, cost more than frostbitten fingers. Headwear tended towards simple wool caps or hoods, often attached directly to the cloak itself as a single garment, a design choice that reduced the number of separate items a shepherd needed to keep track of and put on correctly in the dark, in a hurry, during an emergency that could not wait for fumbling. This detail, small as it seems, reflects a broader pattern worth noting throughout medieval shepherd equipment generally. Simplicity and reliability were valued over elaborate design, because elaborate equipment that failed, or that took too long to don correctly in an emergency, was worse than useless. A shepherd roused from sleep by the sound of his dogs barking at a wolf near the fold did not have time to fasten an intricate series of buttons and ties. He needed to be moving, staff in hand, within seconds, and every piece of his clothing was, in some sense, designed around that requirement. Footwear beyond the wool wrapping already mentioned often took the form of simple leather shoes, sometimes little more than a single piece of hide gathered and tied around the foot, a design found across much of medieval Europe among the rural poor generally, and by no means unique to shepherds, though the extreme conditions of mountain winter made the inadequacy of such simple footwear a matter of particular consequence. Wealthier shepherds, or those working for a monastery or lord with resources to invest in equipment, might have access to sturdier leather boots, occasionally lined with fur. But the ordinary shepherd's footwear across most of the medieval period and most of mountain Europe remained a genuine point of vulnerability. One that surviving records of Pyrenean shepherds, like those interviewed in the Fournier Register, occasionally mention in passing, describing men whose feet suffered through winters that their upper bodies, better protected by wool cloaks and layers, endured with comparatively less damage. The overall picture that emerges from these fragments, taken together, is neither the crude ignorance that popular imagination sometimes assigns to medieval clothing, nor the romanticized image of effortless rustic hardiness. It is something closer to genuinely intelligent, empirically refined practice, developed over generations of trial and often fatal error, using the one material a shepherd had in true abundance, the wool of his own flock, transformed through his own or his family's labor into the very thing that kept him alive long enough to shear it again next spring. What the flock ate when the grass was gone, we have already discussed hay, and the arithmetic problem it represented for households that wintered their flocks in place, rather than walking them to lowland pasture. But hay alone, even when a family cut and stored every scrap of grass their steep terrain allowed, rarely stretched far enough to see a flock through a genuinely hard winter without supplement. And the supplements medieval shepherds relied on tell us a good deal about how closely mountain communities studied their own environment. Leaf fodder was among the most widespread of these supplements, a practice so old that some scholars believe it predates hay itself as a winter feeding strategy in parts of mountain Europe. Through late summer and into autumn, branches from ash, elm, and various other broadleaf trees were cut, and the leafy branches bundled and dried, much as hay was dried, then stored for winter use, exactly as hay was stored. Ash, in particular, seems to have been valued across a wide swath of alpine and Scandinavian mountain communities, and archaeological pollen evidence from some regions actually shows signs of what researchers call pollarding, the practice of repeatedly cutting a tree back to the same points on its trunk over many years, specifically to encourage the vigorous new leafy growth best suited for fodder, a technique that required a community to manage its trees with exactly the same long-term planning it applied to its hay meadows. The nutritional logic here, though no medieval farmer would have described it in nutritional terms, was sound. Tree leaves, particularly from species like ash, contain meaningful levels of protein and minerals, sufficient to supplement a diet of hay that might otherwise be nutritionally thin by the tail end of a long winter, when the hay itself had been stored for months and had lost some of its original value. A shepherd feeding leaf fodder alongside hay was, in effect, running a more balanced ration than hay alone would provide, arrived at not through any formal understanding of nutrition, but through the same generational trial that shaped every other aspect of mountain shepherding. Families that fed their flocks this way through hard winters tended to lose fewer animals than families that did not, and the practice spread and persisted because it worked. Bark itself, stripped from certain trees and fed directly to livestock in genuine desperation, appears in the record as a last resort measure during the very worst winters, when hay stores ran short before spring grass arrived, a situation serious enough that some medieval agricultural writings and later folk memory describe it explicitly as a sign that a winter had gone badly wrong. Bark provided little real nutrition and offered mostly bulk to fill a starving animal's stomach, buying time rather than genuinely sustaining the flock, and a shepherd forced to strip bark for his sheep knew, as surely as anyone reading the signs today would know, that he was managing a crisis rather than a normal winter. Straw, the dry stalks left over after grain harvest, served as another supplement where it was available, though straw offered even less nutritional value than hay, and was generally used to extend hay stores rather than replace them, mixed in to stretch a limited supply across more days than the hay alone would have covered. In regions where mountain shepherds maintained some connection to lowland grain farming, whether through their own small plots or through arrangements with lowland relatives or trading partners, straw represented a genuinely useful, low-cost bulk feed, even if every shepherd understood it as inferior to proper hay, and reserved it for supplementing rather than sustaining a flock through the hardest stretches of winter. There is also the matter of what shepherds themselves ate, which is a related but distinct question, and the surviving evidence, again drawing significantly on sources like the Fournier Inquisition Register from Montaillou, paints a picture of a diet built almost entirely around what the flock itself and the immediate environment could provide. Cheese, made from ewe's milk during the months the flock was still producing it, represented perhaps the single most important food a shepherd carried with him through a winter, since cheese, unlike fresh milk, kept for months without spoiling and provided a dense, portable source of protein and fat exactly suited to a man whose entire day involved hard physical labor in cold conditions. Bread, where a shepherd had access to it, came from whatever grain his family or community produced or traded for, though bread itself required an oven and regular baking. that a shepherd stationed for weeks at a remote winter fold might not have easy access to, meaning cheese, dried meat where available, and whatever could be foraged or hunted locally often filled the gaps that bread would otherwise have covered. Meat itself, from the flock's own occasional losses, whether an animal that died of natural causes, one culled because it was too weak to survive the winter regardless, or occasionally a lamb slaughtered deliberately when the flock's numbers needed thinning to match available feed, provided a source of protein that a shepherd, out of pure practical necessity, rarely let go to waste even if the death itself was unwelcome. Testimony recorded in the Fournier Register describes shepherds sharing meals of bread, cheese, and occasionally meat around a shared fire. Testimony given not because anyone at the time thought this detail historically significant, but because the inquisitor happened to be probing exactly who ate with whom and what was discussed over those meals, since shared meals were, in the eyes of the church at the time, a meaningful indicator of religious and social affiliation, particularly where suspected heresy was concerned. We will return to this thread later in the evening because the religious life of these mountain communities turns out to be inseparable from their material one in ways that repay close attention. For now, the detail worth holding on to is simply this: the shepherd's winter diet, like his clothing and his shelter, was built almost entirely from what his own labor and his own flock produced, supplemented only lightly by whatever trade or foraging the surrounding landscape allowed. A closed loop of production and consumption that left very little margin for error, and even less margin for waste. The enemy in the dark, no account of medieval mountain shepherding, would be honest if it left out the wolf. Because, for every shepherd across every mountain range we have discussed tonight, from the Pyrenees to the Alps to the Highlands to the Carpathians we have not yet reached, the wolf represented a genuine, constant, and well-documented threat. One that shaped nearly every practical decision a shepherd made about where and how to shelter his flock through the winter months. It is worth being precise about why winter specifically sharpened this danger, rather than assuming wolves were simply a year-round menace of equal intensity in every season. Wolves, like the flocks they preyed upon, faced their own version of the same seasonal food scarcity that drove human transhumance in the first place. Wild prey, deer, and other large herbivores became scarcer and harder to catch through winter, both because deep snow slowed a fleeing animal less than it slowed a pursuing wolf pack in absolute terms, but mostly because the wild prey population itself had already thinned through the autumn hunting season conducted by humans, and because winter malnutrition weakened both predator and prey populations in ways that made every remaining calorie more contested. A domesticated flock, confined in a fold, unable to flee across open country the way a wild deer might, represented a far easier meal than anything the surrounding forest offered a hungry wolf pack in January. wolves, being neither foolish nor lazy, adjusted their behavior accordingly. The documented response to this threat operated on several levels simultaneously, and it is worth walking through each because together they represent one of the more sophisticated pieces of applied knowledge that mountain shepherding produced. The fold itself, the physical enclosure in which a flock spent its nights, was built with the wolf specifically in mind wherever resources allowed, with walls high enough that a wolf could not easily leap them, sited against a natural rock face or steep slope on at least one side to eliminate an entire direction of possible attack, and equipped, where a shepherd could manage it, with some means of closing the entrance completely rather than leaving it open to the night. Dogs represented the second, and arguably more important layer of defense, and we have already discussed the Spanish Masta in the context of the drove roads. But guardian breeds of broadly similar type and function appear across nearly every mountain shepherding tradition in medieval Europe, from the Pyrenean pasture to various now less clearly documented guardian types once kept in the Alps and Carpathians. The essential logic of these dogs differed meaningfully from what we might think of today as a herding dog, the kind that directs a flock's movement through trained behavior. A guardian dog was bred and raised specifically to live among the flock itself, often from puppyhood, bonding with the sheep in a manner that led the dog to treat the flock as something closer to its own social group requiring defense, rather than simply an assignment to be managed. A guardian dog of this type did not chase or herd. It positioned itself between the flock and any perceived threat, and if necessary, fought that threat directly, a role for which size, aggression toward predators specifically, while remaining calm toward the sheep themselves, and sheer physical courage mattered more than the intelligence and trainability prized in herding breeds. The economics of keeping such dogs deserve a moment's attention, because a large guardian dog was expensive to feed, consuming meat, or at minimum substantial scraps that a subsistence household could ill afford to spare. And a shepherd or a shepherding community weighed this cost against the alternative losses a wolf attack might inflict. The calculation, across nearly every mountain shepherding tradition that has left any record of the practice, consistently favored keeping the dogs, which tells you something concrete about how seriously wolves threatened flock survival. The cost of feeding a 50-kilogram mastiff through a winter was judged, again and again, across independent communities that had no contact with one another's specific practices, to be worth paying against the alternative risk. Beyond dogs and folds, shepherds also relied on simple vigilance, the kind Pierre Maury demonstrated in our opening scene, checking the flock through the night, specifically because a wolf attack, when it came, often came without much warning, and a shepherd who slept soundly through an entire winter night risked waking to a scene of real devastation. Fires, kept burning through the night near the fold where fuel allowed, served a dual purpose, providing the shepherd himself with some warmth and light, while also serving as a genuine, if imperfect, deterrent, since wolves, like most wild predators, showed a documented reluctance to approach fire directly, preferring instead to test the perimeter of a fold from a distance, and press their attack only where they found a genuine weakness, a gap in the wall, a poorly closed entrance, a moment when the dogs were distracted or the shepherd asleep. It would be a mistake to suggest that these measures made flocks safe in any absolute sense. Losses to wolves, documented in various local records across medieval mountain Europe, remained a real and accepted cost of the enterprise, one that shepherds and the communities that depended on them budgeted for, in the same way a modern business might budget for an expected rate of equipment failure or spoilage. What the measures did accomplish was reducing that cost to a level a mountain economy could absorb rather than one that threatened to eliminate the flock. And it is this margin, the difference between an acceptable budgeted loss and a catastrophic one, that the combined system of folds, dogs, fire, and simple human vigilance was built to preserve. The Vlachs of the high Balkans, if we travel east from the Alps, past the Adriatic, and into the mountain spine that runs through the Balkans, and up into the Carpathians, we find a shepherding tradition that developed along genuinely distinct lines from anything we have discussed so far, one carried by a people whose very name became, across much of medieval and early modern Europe, essentially synonymous with mountain pastoralism itself. The Vlachs. The term Vlach, used by medieval chroniclers and neighboring populations across a wide swath of southeastern Europe, referred to Romance-speaking pastoral communities scattered through the Balkan Highlands, the Carpathians, and Pindus Mountains of Greece. Communities whose exact origins remain genuinely debated among historians and linguists, tied as they are to unresolved questions about the fate of Latin-speaking populations in the region following the collapse of Roman administration centuries earlier. What is not in serious dispute is that by the medieval period, Vlach communities across this broad mountain region had developed a pastoral economy built around sheep, and notably, transhumance practices that in some respects mirrored what we have already seen in Spain and the Alps, while in other respects reflected the particular demands of Balkan and Carpathian terrain. Vlach transhumance often operated across genuinely vast distances, and significantly, sometimes across what would later become recognized political borders, moving flocks between summer pastures high in the Carpathians or the Pindus Range, and winter grazing in the lower Danubian plains, the Thracian lowlands, or coastal regions of the Aegean, depending on which particular Vlach community and mountain range we are discussing. This cross-border character, which meant Vlach shepherding communities frequently negotiated grazing rights and safe passage with multiple different local rulers and administrations across a single migration route, gave Vlach pastoral society a distinctive degree of autonomy and mobility that set it apart from more geographically fixed shepherding communities elsewhere in Europe. Some historians have described certain Vlach groups as functioning almost as a distinct, semi-autonomous social class defined primarily by their pastoral occupation and mobile way of life rather than by fixed territorial identity, an arrangement that periodically drew both suspicion and grudging accommodation from the settled agricultural and administrative powers whose land the flocks crossed twice yearly. The physical shelters used by Vlach shepherds through the winter months in their permanent or semi-permanent settlements reflected available materials much as we have seen elsewhere. Wooden structures in the more heavily forested Carpathian foothills, simpler stone and turf construction at higher, more exposed elevations, and a strong continued reliance on the same fundamental principle we have encountered throughout this evening, namely that keeping livestock in close proximity to human living quarters through winter served the dual purpose of protecting the animals and warming the people. Traditional Romanian and Carpathian shepherd huts, versions of which persisted in largely unchanged form into the modern era, and were documented by later ethnographers studying practices whose roots clearly extended back centuries, typically featured a central hearth, simple wooden or stone construction, and close integration with covered areas for livestock, an arrangement functionally similar to what we described earlier in the Alpine chalet despite having developed independently, a striking case of convergent solutions arising from a shared underlying problem, rather than from any direct cultural transmission between the two regions. One distinctive feature of Vlach and broader Balkan mountain shepherding worth noting concerns cheese-making technique. Since the region's shepherds developed and maintained through the medieval period sophisticated methods of processing, use milk into various forms of cheese, specifically suited to long-term storage through winter months, when fresh milk production from the flock had ceased entirely. Brined cheeses, preserved in salt water within wooden barrels or animal skin containers, could keep for extended periods, far exceeding what fresh dairy products would allow, providing exactly the kind of dense, storable nutrition that we noted was so critical to shepherd diet generally. And versions of these preservation techniques, refined over an unknown but clearly extensive span of generations, persisted with remarkable continuity into recent centuries, offering historians one of the better windows into medieval practice, precisely because the underlying technique changed so little that later, better documented versions can reasonably illuminate earlier, poorly documented ones. The religious life of flock shepherding communities also presents a genuinely interesting complication for anyone trying to construct a simple narrative of medieval mountain Christianity. Since flock populations, scattered as they were across territory that shifted between Byzantine, Bulgarian, Serbian, Hungarian, and various other political and ecclesiastical authorities over the medieval centuries, often maintained religious practices and folk beliefs that blended Orthodox Christian observance with older pre-Christian traditions tied specifically to the pastoral calendar itself. The movement of flocks, the turning of seasons, and the particular anxieties of a life spent largely apart from settled parish structures and their regular clerical oversight. Saints associated with shepherds and flocks, feast days tied to the specific dates of seasonal migration, and protective folk rituals performed before setting out on a winter journey or before the first snow all appear in the ethnographic record of later centuries. And while we must be careful, as always, about projecting later documented practice too confidently backward onto the medieval period itself, the general pattern, a pastoral society developing its religious calendar around its economic one, appears consistent enough across independent mountain traditions that it likely holds true for medieval flock shepherds as well. Even where direct medieval documentation is thin, the ewe that could not wait for spring, there is a particular cruelty in the timing of sheep reproduction that every medieval shepherd understood intimately, and that modern audiences, largely removed from direct contact with livestock, tend to overlook entirely. Sheep gestation runs approximately 5 months, and the breeding season for most sheep, tied to the natural rhythm of decreasing daylight in autumn, meant that lambing, the birth of new lambs, fell overwhelmingly in late winter or very early spring, precisely the period when a mountain shepherd's resources, both in terms of stored feed and in terms of his own physical endurance after months of hard winter labor, were stretched thinnest. This timing was not, from the flock's biological perspective, an accident or a design flaw. Lambs born in late winter or early spring, provided they survived their first vulnerable weeks, would be strong enough by the time the flock returned to summer pasture, whether that meant a walk back up the mountain or simply the arrival of spring grass in place, to make full use of the season's most abundant and nutritious grazing during exactly the period of their fastest growth. The biological logic served the flock's long-term interest well. It simply happened to impose its heaviest demands on the shepherd at the worst possible moment of the year, when he was already coldest, most tired, and working with the thinnest margin of stored feed and physical reserve that the entire annual cycle offered. A difficult birth, what shepherds and later veterinary literature would call dystocia, a lamb positioned wrong in the birth canal, twins tangled with one another, a ewe too weak from poor winter nutrition to complete labor without assistance, required direct manual intervention. And this is precisely the task we referenced earlier when discussing why gloves were so often abandoned regardless of the cold. A shepherd assisting a difficult lambing worked with bare hands, often for an extended period in the depth of winter, reaching into the ewe to reposition a lamb, applying exactly the kind of delicate physical judgment that thick gloves would have made impossible, conditions where his own hands might be going numb well before the task was finished. There was no anesthetic for the ewe, and no antiseptic beyond whatever basic cleanliness the shepherd could manage. And infection, following a difficult birth, represented a genuine and frequently fatal risk to the mother, even where the intervention itself succeeded in saving the lamb. A newborn lamb faced its own immediate crisis, regardless of how smoothly the birth itself proceeded, because a lamb born wet in freezing temperatures could die of exposure within a remarkably short window if it failed to stand and nurse quickly enough for its own body heat and its mother's milk to establish themselves against the cold. Shepherds developed and relied on a range of interventions for exactly this crisis, rubbing a newborn lamb vigorously with straw or cloth to stimulate circulation and remove birth fluid that would otherwise chill the animal rapidly, bringing weak or borderline lambs directly into the shepherd's own shelter, sometimes into the same small space where the shepherd himself slept, to benefit from the warmth of a fire, or simply the shepherd's own body heat through the first critical hours. And in cases where a ewe rejected her own lamb or died in birth, the practice, documented across numerous shepherding traditions, including in later, better recorded periods that likely reflect medieval practice reasonably faithfully, of attempting to graft an orphaned lamb onto another ewe who had lost her own lamb, using various techniques to disguise the orphan's scent with that of the dead lamb, so the grieving mother would accept it as her own. This last practice deserves a moment's reflection, because it reveals something about the shepherd's relationship to his flock that goes beyond pure economic calculation. However much economic necessity underlay the effort, a shepherd attempting to graft an orphan lamb onto a bereaved ewe was engaged in a delicate, often failed, frequently repeated exercise in applied animal behavior, skinning the dead lamb and tying its hide over the orphan, or rubbing the orphan with fluids from the ewe's own birth, techniques aimed at tricking a mother's sense of smell into accepting a substitute for a loss she could otherwise plainly perceive. The effort involved, sustained sometimes over hours and across repeated attempts, represents more than simple economic rationality alone would predict, since the marginal value of a single surviving lamb weighed strictly against the shepherd's own time, and the comfort of simply letting nature take its course might not always justify the labor on paper, and yet the practice persisted widely and consistently, suggesting that something beyond pure calculation, some genuine attentiveness to the individual animal's fate, shaped how shepherds actually behaved, even within an economic system that ultimately measured the flock in terms of wool, meat, and coin. We should be careful here not to overstate this into a sentimental picture the sources themselves do not fully support. The shepherd's life left little room for pure sentiment divorced from survival, and a ewe or lamb too weak or too costly to save was, in the final calculation, culled or allowed to die, rather than rescued at any cost. Because the flock as a whole, and the family that depended on it, could not be sacrificed for any single animal within it. But within that hard calculation, the evidence consistently suggests a level of skill, patience, and genuine attentiveness toward individual animals that goes well beyond what a purely mechanical view of medieval agriculture might assume. And it is this combination, hard necessity paired with real skill and real care, that seems to characterize the best of medieval mountain shepherding as we can reconstruct it. The body's own reckoning we have touched in passing on the physical toll that decades of mountain shepherding took on a man's body, the bent posture, the old injuries never properly set, the lameness that surviving records describe almost as a defining feature of the aged shepherd rather than an unusual affliction. It is worth dwelling on this more directly, because the medical realities facing a medieval shepherd and the near total absence of anything resembling professional medical care available to him shaped the calculations underlying nearly every decision we have discussed so far. Frostbite, which we have already mentioned in the context of clothing and footwear, represented far more than a temporary discomfort in a world without modern medical intervention. Severe frostbite, left untreated or treated only with whatever folk remedies a community had developed through generations of necessity, could progress to gangrene, and gangrene in a remote mountain valley, days from anything resembling a trained physician, even where such a physician existed within the region at all, frequently meant a slow, painful death from the infection that followed, or in cases where the affected community had access to someone willing and able to attempt an amputation, a crude surgical intervention performed without anesthesia beyond perhaps strong drink, without meaningful antiseptic beyond boiling water or certain herbal preparations, and with a real risk that the intervention itself would kill the patient through blood loss or subsequent infection, even where the original frostbite might not have. It is worth being honest about how little medieval medicine, even at its most sophisticated urban and monastic centers, could actually offer a mountain shepherd facing this kind of injury, and how much further that gap widened for a shepherd stationed at a remote winter fold, hours or days from even the modest medical resources a larger village or monastery might provide. The folk knowledge that did exist, and does, appear in scattered later records. Poultices made from various available plants, the packing of wounds with certain mosses that later scientific analysis would confirm did possess genuine antimicrobial properties, even though no medieval practitioner understood the underlying mechanism, represented the accumulated, empirically tested wisdom of communities that had, through hard and often fatal trial, learned which remedies actually seemed to help and which did not. This body of practical knowledge should not be dismissed as mere superstition, even where it existed alongside genuinely superstitious practices that offered no real physiological benefit. Because distinguishing between the two from a modern vantage point, with the benefit of scientific hindsight, is considerably easier than it would have been for the people living through the uncertainty of the time, unable to run a controlled trial, and forced instead to rely on whatever pattern of outcomes they could observe across a small, isolated population over a single human lifetime. Beyond frostbite and injury, mountain shepherds faced the ordinary array of medieval illness, respiratory infections made more dangerous by weeks of exposure to cold and damp, digestive illness from marginal food supplies or contaminated water, and the simple, cumulative wear of decades of hard physical labor performed in a punishing climate with inadequate nutrition through the leanest stretches of winter. Life expectancy figures for medieval populations generally must be treated with real caution, since infant and child mortality skewed average figures dramatically downward in ways that obscure how long an adult who survived childhood might reasonably expect to live. But even accounting for that distortion, the surviving evidence suggests that mountain shepherds, exposed to conditions that combined nearly every major risk factor for premature death available in the medieval world at once: cold, physical exhaustion, marginal nutrition, isolation from medical care, and real physical danger from both accident and predator, did not typically live into what we would consider old age, and those who did carried the visible evidence of what the life had cost them. The Fournier Register, our recurring window into the specific lives of Pyrenean shepherds like Pierre Maury, includes testimony describing shepherds who died relatively young. Of causes, the surviving Latin summary sometimes specifies and sometimes leaves frustratingly vague, and describes others who lived into what passed for old age in their community bearing injuries, from old wolf encounters, from falls on icy ground, from frostbite survived, but never fully healed, that had shaped the remainder of their working lives around whatever physical limitation the injury had left behind. It would be a mistake to read this evidence as suggesting these were lives defined solely by suffering. The same testimony describes real friendship among shepherds who worked together across many seasons, real pride taken in a flock well managed through a hard winter, real pleasure in food, in music, in the particular freedom of movement and relative independence from direct, daily oversight that shepherding, unlike many other forms of medieval peasant labor, actually afforded. But it would be equally dishonest to soften the physical reality of the work itself, and the historical record, where it exists at all, does not support a soft version of that reality. A life recorded by accident. Let us return properly now to Pierre Maury, because his story, preserved for us only through the peculiar accident of an inquisitor's investigation, offers something almost no other medieval shepherd left behind: a genuinely detailed, first-person account of an actual working life, spoken in his own words and recorded, however imperfectly translated into the Latin of Bishop Jacques Fournier's Register, by a scribe sitting across from him. Pierre Maury was born in Montaillou, a small village in the county of Fournier in the Pyrenees, sometime around the end of the 13th century, into a family that, like much of the village, held sympathies for Catharism, the dualist Christian heresy that the Catholic Church had spent much of the previous century attempting to eradicate across the region known as Languedoc through a combination of preaching, crusade, and eventually the systematic investigative machinery of the Inquisition itself. We will return to the specific religious dimension of Pierre Maury's story shortly, because it is genuinely inseparable from his working life as a shepherd. But for now, the point worth establishing is simply this. Pierre Maury spent much of his adult life as a working shepherd, moving between the high pastures of the Pyrenees and, at various points, further afield into Catalonia and Aragon. Testimony that survives specifically because he was eventually summoned, along with many others from Montaillou and the surrounding region, to answer for his religious associations before Fournier's tribunal. What makes the resulting testimony so valuable to historians is not primarily its religious content, significant as that is, but the sheer incidental detail that emerges as Fournier's investigators pressed Pierre Maury and his fellow villagers to account for their movements, their associates, their conversations, and their daily lives across many years, in an investigation that demanded precisely the kind of granular, dated, and located detail that an ordinary chronicle or land record from the period would never have thought to preserve. We learn, through this testimony, the names of the specific pastures Pierre Maury worked, the names of fellow shepherds he traveled and lived alongside for months at a time, the rough rhythm of his movements between Pyrenean summer pasture and lowland winter grazing across the border in territory controlled by the Crown of Aragon, and countless small domestic details: what was eaten, who slept where, what was discussed by firelight, that no other surviving medieval source of the period offers with anything like the same specificity for a person of Pierre Maury's ordinary social standing. This detail matters enormously for our purposes tonight, because it lets us describe the shepherd's transhumant life not as an abstract system reconstructed from institutional records like those of the Mesta, but as a series of actual, dated, named human experiences. We know, for instance, that Pierre Maury worked at various points for different flock owners, since a working shepherd in the Pyrenean tradition frequently did not own the animals he tended, but was employed by wealthier villagers, minor nobility, or in some cases, monastic institutions that owned substantial flocks and hired shepherds to manage them for a wage, typically paid partly in coin and partly in kind, a share of wool, cheese, or lambs, an arrangement that gave the shepherd a genuine stake in the flock's welfare, even without owning the animals outright. We know that his movements took him across what we would now think of as an international border, from the county of Foix into territory under the crown of Aragon, following pasture rather than political boundary. A reminder that the modern map, with its neatly bounded nation-states, imposes a structure on medieval geography that the people actually living through the period frequently ignored in practice, because grass, not sovereignty, determined where a shepherd needed his flock to be. We also know, from this same testimony, something about the social world a transhumant shepherd inhabited, which turns out to have been considerably richer and more connected than a modern reader might assume for a man who spent much of his working life isolated on remote pasture. Shepherds traveling the same routes, working for the same or neighboring flock owners, formed real and lasting friendships and working relationships, sharing shelter, food, and news across a network that extended well beyond any single village, carrying information, and in Pierre Maury's case, specific religious teaching and Cathar textual tradition across considerable distances, precisely because shepherds moved regularly between communities that otherwise had comparatively little regular contact with one another. The image this creates of the shepherd as an isolated, ignorant rustic cut off from wider currents of medieval life simply does not survive contact with the actual detail Fournier's investigators recorded. Pierre Maury and shepherds like him were, in a very real sense, some of the more well-traveled and well-connected ordinary people of their region, moving across greater distances and encountering a wider range of communities in a given year than many settled peasants would experience across an entire lifetime. None of this diminishes the physical hardship we have spent much of this evening describing. Pierre Maury's testimony includes its own moments of genuine difficulty, describing periods of real poverty, of employment insecurity, when a flock owner's fortunes changed or a working relationship soured, of the constant low-level uncertainty that came with a livelihood dependent on an employer's continued need for his labor, and on weather and pasture conditions entirely outside his own control. But the testimony also preserves something the institutional records alone never could: a sense of Pierre Maury's own voice, his own account of choices made, relationships valued, and a life lived with real agency within genuinely difficult constraints, rather than the flattened, faceless statistic that so much of medieval peasant life is reduced to in sources that never thought to ask an ordinary shepherd what he actually experienced. Faith at the edge of the parish, it would be easy to treat the Cathar sympathies of Montaillou's shepherds as simply a strange historical footnote, interesting only because it happens to be the reason we know so much about Pierre Maury's life in the first place. But the connection between mountain pastoralism and religious heterodoxy in this particular corner of the medieval world runs deeper than mere coincidence. And understanding why helps explain something genuinely important about the texture of religious life in remote mountain communities more generally. Well, beyond the specific case of Catharism in the Pyrenees. Catharism, as it developed across Languedoc and neighboring regions from roughly the 12th century onward, held to a fundamentally dualist theology, positing a cosmic struggle between a good, spiritual God associated with the immaterial world and an evil, material creator associated with the physical world and the flesh. A belief system that led its adherents to reject much of Orthodox Catholic sacramental practice and church hierarchy in favor of a more austere, direct spiritual practice centered on figures called the perfect, or the bonshams, who lived lives of extreme asceticism and served as the true spiritual authorities within Cathar communities, in contrast to the ordinary believers, called credents, who continued to live conventional lives, including, notably, ordinary occupations like shepherding, while maintaining sympathy for and periodic contact with the perfect, and Cathar teaching more broadly. The geography of Cathar survival into the 14th century, well after the earlier Albigensian crusade of the 13th century, had crushed the movement's more open and urban expression in cities like Toulouse and Albi, tracks closely with exactly the kind of remote, mountainous terrain we have spent this evening discussing. And this is not coincidental. Remote mountain villages like Montaillou sat at a genuine distance, both physical and administrative, from the regular oversight of parish clergy and diocesan authority that more accessible lowland communities experienced. And this same physical remoteness that made mountain pastoralism such a demanding livelihood also made it considerably harder for church authorities to maintain the kind of consistent religious surveillance and instruction that shaped Orthodox practice more thoroughly in better connected regions. Shepherds themselves played a genuinely significant role in sustaining this surviving Cathar network, specifically because of the mobility their occupation demanded and enabled. Pierre Maury's own testimony describes him carrying messages, arranging meetings, and providing physical protection and material support to surviving Cathar perfect who moved secretly through the region and eventually across the border into Catalonia to escape the more intense inquisitorial pressure building within France itself, using precisely the same routes, the same knowledge of mountain passes and safe houses along the Transhumance corridor that his ordinary work as a shepherd had already given him intimate familiarity with. In this sense, the shepherd's trade, built around long-distance seasonal movement across a landscape most settled authorities understood only poorly, provided an almost perfect cover and infrastructure for a persecuted religious movement attempting to survive underground, a connection that Fournier's investigators clearly recognized, since their questioning of Pierre Maury and his fellow shepherds returned again and again to exactly these questions of movement, contact, and concealment. This should not be taken to suggest that mountain shepherds were universally or even predominantly heretical, a claim the evidence does not support, and that would flatten a far more complicated religious reality into a false simplicity. Montaillou itself was a relatively small, and by the time of Fournier's investigation, quite exceptional case, a village whose particular history and family networks had made it an unusually persistent center of Cathar sympathy long after the movement had been largely suppressed elsewhere. Most mountain shepherding communities across medieval Europe remained firmly within Orthodox Catholic practice, however loosely and irregularly that practice might have connected to formal parish structures. Given the genuine difficulty of maintaining regular clerical presence in remote, seasonally shifting pastoral communities, what the Montaillou case does illustrate in unusually sharp detail, thanks to the accident of its survival, is a broader and genuinely important pattern. Mountain communities generally, whatever their specific theological content, tended to develop a religious life that operated with real independence from the closer clerical supervision that shaped lowland parish practice, blending official doctrine with local custom, folk belief, and practical adaptation to a way of life that Orthodox religious calendar and practice, designed with settled agricultural communities more centrally in mind, did not always fit especially well. Feast days tied to the practical calendar of transhumance, the departure for summer pasture, the return before winter, protective rituals invoked before a difficult mountain crossing, or before the first winter storm, all appear in various forms across mountain shepherding traditions, well beyond the specific Cathar context of Montaillou, suggesting a genuine and widespread pattern of religious life, shaped as much by the practical rhythms of pastoral labor as by the official liturgical calendar handed down from distant church authority. Wool into gold, we noted earlier in passing that wool represented one of the most valuable commodities a medieval mountain economy could produce. But the full scale of what that meant, both for the shepherds themselves and for the wider medieval world their labor quietly sustained, deserves fuller treatment, because the story of medieval wool is, in a real sense, the story of how a genuinely difficult and dangerous rural occupation became bound up with some of the largest fortunes and most significant economic developments of the entire medieval period. Consider first the sheer scale involved. English wool, produced substantially, though not exclusively from lowland and upland flocks, across regions like the Cotswolds and the Welsh Marches, rather than from the high mountain transhumance systems we have focused on tonight, nonetheless illustrates the broader pattern. By the 13th and 14th centuries, wool had become so central to the English economy that the export tax on raw wool, the custom, represented one of the English crown's single largest and most reliable sources of revenue, important enough that Parliament itself developed much of its early institutional leverage over royal finance, specifically through negotiations over wool taxation. The image of the Lord Chancellor of England, seated to this day on the woolsack in the House of Lords, a large cushion stuffed with wool, survives as a direct physical reminder of exactly how central this single commodity was to medieval and early modern English wealth and governance. Spanish merino wool, the product of the very transhumant Vlachs, whose migration along the Cañadas reels we described earlier followed a similarly outsized economic trajectory. Merino wool's exceptional fineness, a genuine physical property arising from selective breeding practices that Spanish flock owners had refined over generations, commanded premium prices across the great textile manufacturing centers of medieval Europe, from the Flemish cloth towns of Ypres and Ghent to the workshops of Florence and other Italian textile centers, whose merchants and manufacturers depended on a steady supply of high-quality raw wool that Iberian flocks, protected and organized through the Mesta, were uniquely positioned to provide at the necessary scale and consistency. The wealth this trade generated flowed overwhelmingly toward the owners of large flocks, toward the crown that taxed the wool's export, and toward the merchant houses that financed and profited from its movement across Europe. A wealth that stood in genuinely stark contrast to the material circumstances of the individual shepherds, like Pierre Maury, whose labor made the entire system function, but who typically received only a modest wage, paid partly in coin and partly in kind, for work that carried real physical danger and offered little prospect of significant personal enrichment. This disparity is worth sitting with honestly, because it complicates any temptation to romanticize the medieval wool economy purely through the lens of the shepherd's skill and endurance. Impressive as that skill and endurance genuinely were, the system that made European wool one of the great commodities of the medieval economy rested at its foundation on the labor of men who walked hundreds of kilometers on foot through genuine physical danger, who risked frostbite, wolf attack, and isolation from any meaningful medical care in exchange for a wage that, while sufficient in many cases to sustain a family at a modest but real standard of living, captured only a small fraction of the value that labor ultimately generated once the wool reached the looms of Flanders, or the account books of Castilian and Florentine merchants. The shepherds we have discussed tonight were, in the most literal economic sense, essential workers within one of medieval Europe's largest and most lucrative industries, and their material reward for that essential role remained, throughout most of the period, genuinely modest. The cheese that bought the winter. We have mentioned cheese several times already as a critical component of the shepherd's own winter diet. But cheese making in alpine mountain communities specifically represented something considerably more significant than mere personal sustenance, and understanding its fuller economic role helps explain a genuinely important piece of how mountain communities managed to convert a few short months of summer abundance into a form of wealth that could see them through the entire rest of the year. The fundamental problem cheese solved was one of timing and preservation. A dairy flock, whether sheep, goats, or cattle, depending on the specific region and altitude, produced milk in real abundance only through the months it grazed rich summer pasture, precisely the 4 or so months when grass at high altitude reached its peak productivity. Fresh milk itself, however, could not be transported any meaningful distance or stored for any meaningful length of time without spoiling, particularly in an era without refrigeration of any kind, which meant that the extraordinary seasonal abundance of high alpine summer milk production would have been almost entirely wasted, available only to whoever happened to be present at the exact moment and place of production. Had mountain communities not developed cheese making techniques specifically designed to convert that fleeting abundance into a stable, storable, and tradable form of wealth, alpine communities developed across the medieval centuries several distinct traditions of large format, long-aged cheese specifically suited to this problem. Cheeses whose ancestors would eventually become recognizable regional products still made in broadly similar fashion today, including early forms of what would become Gruyere in the region around the Swiss and French Alps, and Beaufort in Savoy, though we should be careful about projecting the specific, legally protected modern versions of these cheeses too precisely backward onto medieval practice, since the formal regulation and even some of the specific technique refinement that define the modern products developed considerably later. What does appear to hold true across the medieval period, based on what evidence survives, is the underlying strategic logic. Large wheels of hard, aged cheese made from the abundant summer milk and requiring cooperative labor and shared equipment that individual small households often could not manage alone. Hence the early development of communal dairies and cheese-making cooperatives in various alpine regions could then be stored through the winter and either consumed slowly by the household that made them or traded to lowland markets in exchange for grain, salt, and other necessities the mountain community could not produce for itself. This cooperative dimension deserves particular attention because it reveals something significant about how mountain communities organize themselves around the shared problem of converting seasonal abundance into year-round security. A single household's flock, however carefully managed, often produced more milk in the height of summer than that household alone could efficiently process into cheese using whatever equipment and labor it had immediately available. Alpine communities responded to this problem through various forms of shared dairying, pooling milk from multiple household flocks at a communal dairy, sometimes attached to the same high summer pasture huts we discussed earlier, sharing the labor of the cheese-making process itself, and then dividing the resulting cheese production among participating households according to established, often quite precisely calculated formulas based on each household's contribution of milk. This kind of formalized cooperative arrangement, requiring genuine trust, careful record keeping of contribution and division, even in communities with limited formal literacy, and enforceable social agreement about fair shares, represents a genuinely sophisticated piece of medieval rural economic organization, one that persisted in recognizably similar form into the modern era in various alpine regions specifically, because it solved a real problem that no individual household could solve as efficiently alone. The resulting cheese, once made and properly aged, a process that itself required specific knowledge about temperature, humidity, and timing that mountain communities refined through the same generational trial and error, we have seen shape every other aspect of their practice, became genuinely valuable both as stored food for the household's own winter consumption and as a tradable commodity that could be carried down to lowland markets. Exchanged for grain, the mountain's poor arable land often could not produce in sufficient quantity for salt essential to both human diet and to further food preservation, and for whatever modest cash income a mountain household might need for taxes, for tools, or for the occasional purchase that subsistence production alone could not provide. In this sense, the humble wheel of aged mountain cheese functioned within the medieval alpine economy in a role not entirely unlike the one wool played in the broader transhumant economies of Spain and elsewhere. A way of converting the mountain's one genuine seasonal abundance, rich summer grazing, into a stable store of value that could carry a household through the long months when the mountain itself offered nothing. Far north, our survey so far has focused on the mountain ranges of southern and central Europe, but the broader phenomenon of seasonal pastoral movement between summer highland and winter lowland pasture extended considerably further north as well, into Norway and the broader Scandinavian world, where a system called setter or cedar farming developed along genuinely similar lines to the alpine chalet tradition, adapted to the specific demands of Norwegian mountain and fjord geography. The Norwegian setter, much like the alpine summer pasture hut, represented a temporary summer dwelling and dairying station located at higher elevation than the main farmstead, typically staffed through the summer months by women and older children of the farming household, while the men remained at the main farm, managing the hay harvest and other work that the short Norwegian growing season demanded be completed with real urgency. This gendered division of labor, with women managing the setter's dairy production largely independently for months at a stretch, appears with real consistency across the Scandinavian evidence and represents a genuinely significant, if often understated, dimension of medieval pastoral life that deserves more attention than it traditionally receives. A point we will return to shortly in its own right. Winter in the Norwegian context brought the flocks and herds back down from the setter to the main farmstead, much as alpine cattle and sheep returned to the valley floor villages where they wintered in byres attached to or near the farmhouse, fed on hay cut and stored through the brief but intensive Norwegian summer haymaking season. The specific challenge Norwegian mountain and fjord farming faced, beyond the general cold common to all the regions we have discussed, involved the sheer brevity of the growing season at these northern latitudes, which left an even narrower window than alpine communities faced for cutting and storing sufficient hay, a constraint that shaped settlement patterns and agricultural practice across the entire region in ways that persisted for centuries. Norwegian and broader Scandinavian evidence for the specifically medieval period remains, like much of what we have discussed tonight, considerably thinner than we might wish, reconstructed substantially through a combination of archaeological evidence, place name analysis, since many setter names recorded in later documents clearly derive from medieval or even earlier origins, and careful, cautious extrapolation backward from better, documented early modern practice that appears, in its fundamental structure, to have changed relatively little from whatever medieval predecessor it descended from. This pattern of relying on later, richer documentation to illuminate an earlier, poorly recorded period, while exercising appropriate caution about how far back we can confidently project any specific detail, recurs throughout our entire subject tonight. And it is worth being honest about this evidentiary limitation, rather than presenting a false confidence about details that the medieval record itself simply does not provide with certainty. The women who are missing from the record, if you have noticed, across everything we have described so far, that the shepherds named and quoted have been almost entirely men. This is not because women played no role in mountain pastoral life. It is because the surviving record, shaped as it overwhelmingly is by legal, ecclesiastical, and administrative documents produced by and largely concerned with men, tends to render women's labor within this economy far less visible than it actually was. And it is worth pausing to correct that distortion as honestly as the fragmentary evidence allows. We have already noted, in the Norwegian context, that setter dairying was frequently managed by women independently for months at a time, a pattern that appears, with variation in its specific institutional form, across other mountain pastoral traditions as well. In many alpine communities, the labor of milking, of the actual cheese-making process itself, and of managing the high summer pasture huts more broadly, fell substantially to women, even in households where men handled the broader logistics of moving flocks between summer and winter pasture. This division of labor meant that women in mountain communities were frequently exercising genuine, sustained managerial authority over a significant portion of the household's economic production, authority that the surviving legal and tax records, focused as they typically were on male household heads for purposes of taxation and land tenure, simply do not reflect with anything like the prominence the actual labor deserves. The Fournier Register, our recurring and unusually rich window into Pyrenean shepherd life, does preserve some genuine testimony from women of Montaillou and the surrounding region. And this testimony, while primarily elicited for its relevance to the Inquisitor's religious investigation, rather than out of any interest in documenting women's economic role, nonetheless offers glimpses of women's involvement in the broader pastoral economy of the village, managing household affairs during a husband's or son's long absence with the flock, participating in the local textile production that transformed raw wool into finished cloth or thread, and maintaining the complex web of social and familial relationships that held a small mountain community together across the long months when its shepherding men were away. It is worth noting, too, that widowhood in mountain pastoral communities sometimes placed women in a position of more direct and visible authority over flock management than the general pattern might suggest, since a widow inheriting her late husband's flock, in the absence of a grown son able to take on that responsibility, needed either to manage the animals herself, hire a shepherd to do so on her behalf, or sell the flock outright. And surviving records from various medieval mountain regions do document women appearing in exactly this kind of direct economic role, negotiating with hired shepherds, disputing grazing rights, and managing the sale of wool or cheese, even though such women appear in the surviving documentation less frequently than their actual economic significance likely warranted, simply because the kinds of records that survive tend to foreground the more legally and administratively prominent transactions conducted by men. We should resist, in acknowledging this gap in the record, the temptation to simply invent detail the evidence does not support in order to fill it. It is more honest, and ultimately more useful, to say plainly that women's labor within medieval mountain pastoral economies was almost certainly more extensive, more skilled, and more economically significant than the surviving record, filtered as it is through documents produced primarily by, and for men, directly reflects, while acknowledging that the specific texture of that labor, the exact words women might have used to describe their own experience of it, remains far more thinly documented than we might wish. A genuine limitation of the sources, rather than a reflection of women's actual absence from the working life. We have spent this evening describing what the mountain taught about fear. Every mountain shepherding tradition we have surveyed tonight developed, alongside its practical technical knowledge of shelter, feed, and flock management, a body of folk belief and protective ritual specifically oriented around the dangers of winter. And while we should be careful about treating this folklore as merely primitive superstition, standing in contrast to the genuinely sophisticated practical knowledge we have spent most of this evening describing, it is worth understanding these beliefs on their own terms as a genuine and psychologically significant part of how shepherds made sense of, and prepared themselves for real, serious danger. Protective rituals performed before the departure for winter pasture, or before setting out to check a flock during a serious storm, appear across numerous mountain traditions in forms that later folklorists and ethnographers, working in the early modern and modern periods, recorded from communities whose underlying practices very likely extended back considerably further into the medieval period itself, even where direct medieval documentation of the specific ritual is lacking. These might include particular prayers or blessings invoked over the flock or over the shepherd's own equipment, the marking of doorways or fold entrances with protective symbols, or the observance of specific taboos, certain tasks that should not be performed on particular days, certain words that should not be spoken while a storm was approaching, out of a belief that violating these taboos might invite misfortune upon the flock or the shepherd himself. It would be a mistake to view these practices as entirely separable from the practical knowledge we have spent this evening detailing. Because, in the lived experience of a medieval shepherd, the boundary between practical technique and protective ritual likely felt far less distinct than it does to a modern observer sorting the historical record into categories of the rational and the superstitious. A shepherd who performed a particular ritual before setting out into a storm, and who also, in the same breath, checked that his dogs were alert, that his staff was in hand, and that he knew the safest path to the fold, was not necessarily distinguishing sharply between these different kinds of preparation. Both served the same psychological and practical function, reducing, or at least managing, the genuine and constant fear that came with facing real physical danger, alone or in the company of only a few fellow shepherds, in an environment that offered little margin for error and no guarantee of rescue if something went badly wrong. The specific fear of wolves, which we discussed at length earlier in purely practical terms, also generated a rich body of folklore across nearly every mountain shepherding tradition we have examined, stories and beliefs about wolves possessing near supernatural cunning, about specific protective charms or practices believed to ward off an attack, and in some regions, folk beliefs bordering on werewolf mythology that blurred the line between the literal predator threatening the flock and a more symbolically loaded figure representing the broader, more diffuse anxieties of a life spent in genuine physical danger at the edge of settled human civilization. These beliefs, whatever their specific local form, served a real psychological function for communities facing a threat that was both genuinely dangerous and, despite the practical countermeasures we have described, never fully within human control. A shepherd could build the strongest fold available to him, keep the best dogs his household could afford, and maintain the most careful vigilance through the darkest winter nights. And still, on a bad night, lose animals to a wolf attack that no amount of preparation had fully prevented. The folklore that grew up around this irreducible uncertainty gave shepherds a way of narrating and processing a risk that practical knowledge alone could manage, but never entirely eliminate. 3 days in a storm let us return for a moment to the kind of storm we opened with, and walk through what such an event actually demanded of a shepherd, hour by hour, because the abstractions we have discussed so far, the folds, the dogs, the layered wool, the stored hay, only fully make sense when you see them deployed together against a single sustained crisis, rather than described separately as isolated techniques. A serious mountain storm rarely announced itself with much warning by modern standards, though shepherds, reading signs in the sky, in the behavior of birds and livestock, in the particular quality of a wind shift that a lifetime of exposure had taught them to recognize, often had some sense that conditions were worsening before the worst of it arrived. Once the snow began in earnest, driven by wind strong enough to reduce visibility to almost nothing within an hour, the shepherd's first and most urgent task was ensuring the flock itself was secured in whatever fold or shelter was available, counted if possible, though an accurate count in blinding snow with several hundred moving animals was often more aspiration than achievable fact, and settled as deep into whatever natural or built shelter existed as the terrain allowed. The following hours, and in a genuinely severe storm, days demanded a kind of endurance that is difficult to fully convey without direct experience of it. The shepherd himself, confined to whatever shelter he had, a borry, a mazot, a simple stone hut, needed to manage his own survival, rationing fuel for whatever small fire he could maintain, since a fire built too large too early risked leaving nothing for the storms later, often more dangerous hours, and rationing his own food in the same spirit, uncertain exactly how long the storm itself might last, and unwilling to exhaust his supplies before knowing. Sleep came in fragments, if at all, interrupted by the need to check on the flock, since a fold that seemed secure at midnight might, by 3 in the morning, have accumulated enough drifted snow against one wall to create a genuine risk of animals piling against each other in a corner and suffocating. A real and documented hazard that experienced shepherds specifically watched for during exactly this kind of prolonged, heavy snowfall. The psychological dimension of this endurance deserves as much attention as the physical one, because a shepherd alone, or with only 1 or 2 companions, isolated by a storm that might genuinely cut off any possibility of outside help or rescue for its full duration, faced a kind of sustained uncertainty that is easy to underestimate from a comfortable distance. He could not know with any certainty exactly how long the storm would last, whether his shelter would hold, whether the flock, however carefully secured, would survive the accumulated stress of cold, confinement, and reduced feed intact, or whether some specific crisis, a collapsed section of fold wall, a wolf pack taking advantage of reduced visibility, and a shepherd's necessarily divided attention, might yet emerge from conditions that already demanded his full vigilance, simply to manage the baseline situation. This uncertainty, sustained across days rather than hours, represents a genuine psychological burden that the practical measures we have described throughout this evening could reduce, but never entirely eliminate. When a storm finally broke, and shepherds across the traditions we have surveyed tonight describe this moment with what surviving testimony suggests was genuine, hard-won relief. The work was by no means finished. The flock needed to be dug out where snow had drifted against the fold, counted properly now that visibility allowed it, checked individually for injury, frostbite affecting ears or legs, or simple exhaustion, and any animals found dead or dying needed to be dealt with promptly, both to prevent disease and, where the situation allowed it, to salvage what value remained in hide or meat from an animal that had not survived. The shepherd himself, having endured the same days of cold, poor sleep, and sustained vigilance, faced this recovery work in a state of real physical depletion. And it is worth remembering, as we noted earlier regarding the cumulative toll of decades in this occupation, that this kind of experience, storm after storm across a working lifetime, represented not an occasional dramatic crisis, but something closer to the ordinary, expected texture of a mountain shepherd's winter, repeated with variation many times across every season he worked. It is this repeated, grinding, largely unrecorded endurance, rather than any single dramatic event, that best characterizes what survival actually meant for the shepherds we have spent this evening discussing. There was no single heroic act that secured a flock's survival through a medieval mountain winter. There was only the accumulated weight of thousands of small, careful decisions about where to site a fold, how much hay to cut, when to bring a weak lamb inside, how tightly to ration fuel through an uncertain storm's opening hours, made correctly often enough, across enough winters, by enough shepherds, that the flocks, the communities, and the broader economy built on their labor persisted, one hard season at a time, across the centuries we have been describing. A world that outlasted its own records. It is worth asking, before we close, how long this world actually persisted. And the honest answer is considerably longer than most people assume, and considerably more unevenly than a single tidy end date could ever capture. The medieval structures we have spent this evening describing, the Cañadas of Castile, the Alpine chalet economy, the Vlach transhumance corridors of the Balkans and Carpathians, the Norwegian setter system, did not vanish at some clean boundary marking the end of the Middle Ages. Many of them continued, in recognizably similar form, for centuries afterward, adapting gradually to changing economic and political circumstances, rather than disappearing all at once. The Mesta itself, the institutional backbone of Spanish transhumance, persisted as a powerful and privileged body well into the early modern period. Its rights and protections increasingly resented by Spanish farmers and local municipalities, who felt the ancient droveways and grazing privileges increasingly at odds with their own agricultural interests. A tension that grew more pronounced across the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries as Spain's agricultural economy diversified and the crown's own relationship to wool revenue evolved. The Mesta was not formally abolished until 1836, a date that sits jarringly close to living memory by the standards of everything else we have discussed tonight. A reminder that the medieval world we have spent this evening reconstructing did not end so much as it gradually, unevenly dissolved into the modern one, leaving traces that, in the case of Spain's drove roads, remain legally protected and in occasional active use even today. The Alpine cheese-making traditions we described followed a similarly gradual evolution rather than any sharp break, with cooperative communal dairying practices persisting, and in some respects strengthening through the early modern period, eventually formalizing into the protected designation systems that govern cheeses like Gruyere and Beaufort in the present day. Systems whose specific legal and technical apparatus is entirely modern, even as the underlying cooperative logic and basic technique trace back, in reasonably continuous form, to the medieval practices we have described. Similarly, the Norwegian setter system persisted with real continuity into the 19th and even 20th centuries in some regions, gradually declining not because of any single dramatic event, but through the slow accumulation of broader economic change, rural depopulation, and the eventual availability of alternative feed and transportation technologies that reduced the specific necessity of the seasonal high pasture system that medieval Norwegian farmers had relied on. What eventually did transform this world across the different regions we have surveyed tonight was not any single cause, but a convergence of several genuinely significant developments spread across the early modern and modern periods. The gradual privatization and enclosure of common grazing land across much of Europe, which reduced the open pasture that transhumant flocks depended on. The rise of alternative wool-producing regions, and eventually synthetic and cotton textile competition that undermined the economic centrality wool had once held. Improved transportation, first canals, and then railways, which altered the calculus of moving livestock and agricultural goods across long distances, and more gradually still, the broader rural depopulation of mountain regions across Europe, as industrialization drew labor toward cities and away from the demanding, marginal returns of traditional mountain agriculture and pastoralism. It would be a mistake to read this decline as a story of simple obsolescence, a superior modern system straightforwardly replacing an inferior older one. The medieval and early modern transhumance systems we have described represented a genuinely sophisticated, carefully calibrated adaptation to specific environmental constraints. mountain terrain with sharply seasonal grass production. That modern industrial agriculture, for all its technological advantages, still has not entirely solved in every context, which is precisely why versions of transhumance, considerably modernized in their specific mechanics, but recognizable in their underlying logic, persist in parts of Spain, France, Italy, Romania, and elsewhere even today, sustained now often as much by cultural heritage value and specific quality food branding as by the pure economic necessity that drove the medieval system, but persisting nonetheless because the basic environmental problem those medieval shepherds solved has never actually gone away. What the mountain remembers, we began this evening with Pierre Maury, alone in a stone hut above Montaillou, listening to a storm test the roof he had built with his own hands, worried for a flock that represented, in the most literal sense, his family's entire material security for the coming year. It seems right to end by asking what exactly that single scene, and the thousands like it that we can only imagine because so few were ever recorded, actually adds up to across the centuries we have spent this evening surveying. It is tempting, and not entirely wrong, to frame this as a story of remarkable resilience, of ordinary people solving genuinely difficult environmental problems through patient, accumulated, largely unwritten knowledge, passed from parent to child, refined through hard and sometimes fatal trial across generations, without the benefit of formal science, without reliable medicine, without any institution beyond the shepherd's own family and immediate community to fall back on when things went wrong. That framing is true as far as it goes, and it deserves to be said plainly, because the sheer competence embedded in a medieval shepherd's understanding of shelter siting, wool layering, flock management, and seasonal migration represents a genuine intellectual achievement that the historical record, focused as it so often was on kings and battles and church councils, rarely gave its proper due. But it would be incomplete, and perhaps even a little dishonest, to end there without also acknowledging the cost this resilience actually exacted, and the inequality it was built upon. The wealth that transhumant will ultimately generated flowed disproportionately toward flock owners, toward the crown that taxed its export, toward the merchant houses of Flanders and Florence, who turned raw fiber into fortune, while the shepherds whose labor and physical risk made that entire system function received, for the most part, only a modest wage and a hard, dangerous, physically punishing life in return. Pierre Maury himself, whose voice we have been fortunate enough to recover through the peculiar accident of an inquisitor's investigation, lived much of his adult life in genuine economic precarity, dependent on the continued goodwill of flock-owning employers, exposed to real physical danger that no wage could fully compensate, and eventually caught up in a religious persecution that would claim the lives of people he loved, and very possibly, though the final record of his own fate remains uncertain, his own life as well, It is worth sitting for a moment with that uncertainty, because it is honest in a way that a neater ending would not be. We do not know, with full confidence, exactly how or when Pierre Maury's own story ended. The Fournier Register, extraordinary as it is, was compiled for the Church's own purposes, not for the benefit of future historians, and it preserves what the Inquisitor's questions happened to elicit rather than a complete biography extending to a documented death. Somewhere in that gap, in that silence, where the record simply stops rather than concluding, sits the actual, ordinary reality of most medieval lives, including nearly every shepherd we have discussed tonight, who left no Fournier Register, no Inquisitor's curiosity, to preserve even a fragment of their voice. Most of these lives simply ended unrecorded, the way most human lives throughout most of history have ended, leaving behind only the flocks they tended, the wool they sheared, the folds and huts and cheese-making techniques they built and refined, evidence of a life rather than an account of one. That absence, that silence, is not a failure of this evening's storytelling. It is the actual shape of the past we have been trying honestly to describe. For every Pierre Maury whose testimony survives, because a bishop happened to be hunting heretics in his particular corner of the Pyrenees, there were countless other shepherds across the Alps, the Highlands, the Carpathians, the high plateaus of Castile, whose winters, whose storms endured, whose lambs saved through cold bare hands, whose folds built stone by careful stone against a mountainside chosen for its shelter from the wind, simply happened without anyone thinking to write it down, because it was, to the people living it, not remarkable. It was simply what the mountain required, and what, winter after winter, generation after generation, they gave it. The stone huts remain, scattered across hillsides in Provence and the Pyrenees, their corbelled roofs still standing without a single piece of mortar to hold them together, built by hands that have been gone for the better part of 1,000 years. The drove roads remain too, some of them protected now by law rather than by necessity, walked today more often by hikers than by flocks of merino sheep bound for winter pasture. And somewhere in the archives at Pamiers, in a register, a bishop commissioned for reasons that had nothing to do with honoring the people he interrogated, a shepherd's own words about his own life still sit, waiting, as they have waited for 700 years, for someone to actually listen to what he had to say. That, perhaps, is the quietest and truest thing this evening's story can offer, a triumphant account of survival against the odds, though there is real triumph buried within it, but a simple acknowledgement that these lives happened, that they mattered to the people living them, and that the mountain, cold and indifferent as it was, still remembers them in the only way a mountain can, in the stones still standing where careful hands once placed them, and in the quiet, undramatic fact that the flocks came down safely, most winters, most years, because someone was awake in the dark, watching.